Hello, good afternoon, good evening, and good day. My name is Kate Orff. I'm a professor at Columbia University in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I wanted to welcome everyone to this session of the Managed Retreat Conference. It's been an overwhelming conference with so many fascinating links. It's been hard to know where to focus, but if you love ecosystems and natural spaces, this is the session to attend. We have an incredible group of speakers, and the format of this particular session is called sort of like a flash presentation or a lightning presentation. And the topic is ecosystem conservation. And so I wanted to just give a couple of introductory remarks or sentences, and then we will go right into the presentations and begin. But in the session, we'll hear from a range of 8 different speakers or groups of speakers around ecosystem conservation. What is its role in managed retreat? And really, what is the role of or protective benefit of robust and intact ecosystems? How can coral reefs, mangoes, wetlands, oyster reefs, marshes serve and add protective benefit and be truly valued as infrastructure in this conversation? We need to preserve and sustain these landscapes. And we need to think also in proactive and creative ways about, frankly, post-settlement landscapes. What's the role of conservation organizations? What's the role of science? And what is the urgency that we face? And several of the speakers will be addressing these larger topics. We also have quite an international group, so I'm very excited to see true leaders in this space from the New York region combined with an international perspective. So joining us this evening are Sara Arteaga and Juliana Veléz from the Department of City Planning in Apartadó. And we have Brian Batten from Dewberry. We have Dorothy Peteet from NASA GISS and Columbia University. We have Judith Weis of Rutgers University, Marit Larson at NYC Parks and Recreation, Alison Branco from TNC, the Nature Conservancy, Scott Warner from University of Newcastle and BBJ Group, and also Malio Kodis from the Nature Conservancy. So 8 different perspectives, 8 different presentations, but all kind of centered around valuing ecosystems and understanding their protective benefit within the managed retreat conversation. So the speakers will each be presenting for about 8 minutes with a maximum of 10 minutes. And this session is being recorded as well. So you'll be able to reference their presentations later or afterwards. We will be hearing the presentations in exactly the order that I spoke of. So, and as you can see, I would just ask each of the speakers to give a slightly more robust introduction of themselves as you begin. So without further ado, I believe we will say again, welcome to all of our esteemed speakers. Thank you all for joining us in the audience. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Sara and Juliana. And I will go on mute and stop my video, and you can share your screen. Again, welcome everyone, and we look forward to all of these presentations.
So hello everyone, we are Juliana Veléz and Sara Arteaga. We are both architects and we work as urban and environmental planning advisors for the city of Apartadó in Colombia. Today we're going to talk about the Apartadó River Master Plan, and we're going to begin with a little bit of context. The Apartadó River is located in the northeastern part of Colombia. Colombia is part of the Intertropical American Zone and is home to the greatest biodiversity per square kilometer on the planet and the greatest diversity of birds and orchids. The Colombian territory is also characterized by its amphibious condition. 26% of its area is covered by wetlands. This diversity that I mentioned earlier is also present at the cultural level. By that, I mean that multiple ethnicities coexist in the country, of which two groups stand out, the indigenous and Afro communities. The specific area of the country in which the project is located is called the Urabá region. It holds one of the 36 recognized biodiversity hotspots established by the Conservation International Organization. The region is home to 6 Afro-Colombian and 74 indigenous communities. It's also known for the heavy presence of agro-industrial banana plantations, accounting for almost 75% of Colombia's banana production, of which 65% is for export purposes. This monoculture has a heavy impact on the surrounding biodiversity. Cities in the Urabá region are located near rivers and in the alluvial plain of the Avive mountain range. They generally lack strong governance and have limited resources. The city of Apartadó is located near the Apartadó River. The city is named after the suffix "do," which comes from the indigenous Embera word for river. Apartadó means river of plantains or river of bananas. This river source begins at the Serranía de Avive mountain range, located 1,000 meters above sea level, and eventually flows about 50 kilometers into the León River, located at sea level. The city was established on the river's floodplain, reducing its drainage capacity and increasing its susceptibility to flooding. The fact that the river also meanders contributes to the floodplain's degradation and erosion. Additionally, its riverbed has been modified to irrigate plantain and banana fields, which causes water shortages in times of drought. Different communities live close to the Apartadó River. As you can see, there are Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, as well as the city itself. The Serranía de Avive mountain range is inhabited by indigenous and rural communities that were seriously affected by the armed conflict. These communities established the San Jose Apartadó Peace Community, in which they seek to provide new opportunities to victims of the conflict through sustainable cacao crops. They depend on the river for this and other agricultural activities. The river crosses the city from east to west in the urban area, having contact with different communities in vulnerable conditions. Finally, in the town of Puerto Giró, situated at the mouth of the river, there is an Afro-Colombian community also affected by the armed conflict. This community has a close relationship with the river, both at the economic level through fishing, which represents a significant source of income, and at a cultural level through their cosmogony and vernacular palafittic architecture.
The close relationship with the river has been fundamental in the way in which the city has grown. However, it has exposed communities to severe flash flooding events that happen approximately every 6 to 10 years. With precipitation projected to increase around 10% due to climate change, extreme weather events associated with the river will also become stronger and far more frequent. In Apartadó's urban area, as many as 20 neighborhoods are affected by the natural flooding area of the river, which is equivalent to almost 50% of all urban neighborhoods. If this issue is not considered in how the city plans for climate change, we could be talking about hundreds of climate displaced people. The Department of Antioquia, where the Apartadó River is located, is the first Colombian department to declare a climate emergency. As part of their action plan to mitigate and adapt to climate change, the government of Antioquia has launched the initiative Parks of the River. The initiative uses urban design and planning strategies to manage risk in cities near rivers, while at the same time increasing the resilience through natural urban parks. The Apartadó River Master Plan has been prioritized as the most strategic project of this initiative because it combines both the intervention of the Apartadó River and the update of the city's zoning plan. Apartadó River's Master Plan seeks to intervene 135 hectares and 4.5 miles along the river. It hopes to increase resilience to flooding by replanting the river basin and using nature-based solutions to mitigate risk in the urban area. The project will triple the green space per inhabitant index. Mitigating and preventing the risk of flooding as much as possible will allow for communities to safely coexist with the river and preserve the cultural and historical relationship they have sustained with the affluent for decades. Managed retreat becomes a complicated issue when considering the incredible amount of biodiversity in Apartadó, but also the pluridiversity reflected in indigenous tribes and Afro communities and other cultures present in the city. Uprooting them from these territories means losing an opportunity of achieving sustainable habitat preservation in hand with ancestral communities. This is why we are avoiding implementing managed retreat, but instead working with ecosystem-based adaptation strategies and nature-based solutions designed conjointly with these communities. Their knowledge is a key pillar of environmental restoration, as there is a strong connection between these communities and biodiversity conservation. This also means including the victims of the armed conflict. The unique knowledge of the territory and the economies that depend on the river can be an opportunity to reach resilience while also promoting peace. We have developed participatory planning workshops with the different communities to understand the relationship with the river at a cultural and economic level and to identify their knowledge of ecological restoration. In the rural areas, we propose ecosystem-based adaptation strategies such as forest protection and participatory ecological restoration, especially in areas close to river source to ensure supply of water and mitigate the risk of flooding and landslides in the urban area. In the urban area, we're using design principles based on the concept of water-sensitive cities, and some strategies include increasing green areas and canopy cover, designing and implementing sustainable urban drainage systems that adapt to the local vegetation and the environment, creating resilient adaptation guidelines for the 20 neighborhoods adjacent to the river, a strategy that is called eco-resilient neighborhoods, and creating green buffers of flood detention zones. We are also working on a monitoring program that will allow the city to measure the success of these strategies as they take further action if necessary. We are only just exploring this topic in Colombia. These types of projects open the door for new discussions about how we adapt in a just and equitable way. These communities have suffered historical displacement due to the armed conflict and therefore have developed strong ties with the places where they currently live. Additionally, territories such as Colombia, biodiversity is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. This is because there are a large number of endemic species that have difficulty adapting to new habitats. We are still figuring out how to reduce risk to vulnerable communities while avoiding a massive uprooting that could compromise their cultural heritage and biodiversity conservation. While we still don't know the magic formula to make this happen, we're working closely with communities to understand their needs and worries, and this will help managed retreat to be carried out with an equity lens. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's incredible work, and I can only imagine almost every town and city in this region, needing to sort of undergo this resilience and equity, revisioning. Just incredible, and I can only imagine that the episodes of flooding, etc., would be coming more and more severe as climate changes. Thank you so much. So now I would like to invite Brian Batten to share his screen. And hopefully I wanted to say to all of the audience members, if you have a question, you can share it in the chat box and we'll try to get to them if we have 10 minutes at the end of the session. Brian, take it away.
All right, thank you. And thanks for joining us this evening. I think given the overall topic of this session, I may be a little bit of the odd man out, but if we're focusing more on a project and effort looking at transfer of development rights and how and when, if you're looking at transferring a property to convert it back to open space, what are some of the mechanics of that and how may it happen? I just want to, before I dive in, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, John Scrisciati, who's a hazard mitigation specialist at Dewberry. We're an architecture engineering consulting company in the US, and Mary Carson Stiff, who's a policy and lawyer at Wetlands Watch, an adaptation organization in Norfolk, Virginia. So the specific topic here is what we're looking at as part of a transfer of development rights under that topic, and specifically how the mechanics of transferring a property ownership over to a trust after a certain amount of time. Specific item in question is in the development of a tool to estimate the value of a contract to undertake this, where the value is set on whether the property is sold immediately to a trust or to whoever's receiving the property, or hanging on that property until a trigger event happens where the property would then go to the trust and then be converted back to open space. And this is for areas that are experiencing course, increased flood impacts and repetitive flood impacts due to sea level rise and coastal flood hazards. So our key role here was looking at the piece on storm damage and sea level rise and how to address that within the context of this need. And our approaches for a trigger event to flood were kind of twofold, looking at it two different ways. But the first was looking at the property, its flood exposure, and then trying to understand how many years that property, how many years would occur or go by until the property loss exceeded 50% of its market value at the beginning of this contract period. So here we're using, looking at a metric what's called annualized loss expectancy. So we look across the probabilistic space of flood events that the property is exposed to, and then understand the value of the property, and then how much damage may accrue any given year, and then when does it achieve this threshold. And this could be 10 years, it could be 30 years, it just depends on the specific attributes of the property. The other way we investigated it was looking at the time-dependent probability of the structure incurring 50% structural damage from a coastal flood. And this is the way that we kind of proceeded with, as it aligned a little bit with how the overall team and the collaborators were addressing the probability of the owner of a death trigger event. So some key input data into this, threefold really. First is coastal hazard data, and here we're looking to two sources. We want to not only understand the current coastal flood hazard environment, and we can turn to some of our FEMA information for that. Not only the flood map, but the information under the flood map that does understand and describe the different recurrence intervals of flood, what their elevation is. So that gives us an estimation of the probabilistic frequency curve of flood exposure at the property location. And then we can also look to the latest federal interagency guidance for sea level rise scenarios in the US, and that would be what's commonly referred to as the NOAA 27 report, and we're using the intermediate high sea level rise projection here. And then in a site-specific application, we have to, the particular building in question that the contract's being considered on, we have to understand the attributes of that building, its foundation type and its first floor elevation. And that helps us understand not only its flood exposure, but what depth damage function to choose. And these functions basically tell us for any given flood elevation what the expected damage to the structure is going to be. And we're looking for that 50% threshold to align with the trigger mechanism. And a consideration here, not only the structure attributes, but where the relative flood exposure of the property itself in terms of wave action, because that amount of wave action does affect the property's loss potential. And so a lot of times in the FEMA world, we have some definitions, but they're there for a purpose. The coastal high hazard zone, or VE, is where we have wave heights greater than 3 feet that tend to cause pretty catastrophic damage to a structure when they occur. A little more moderate damage area in the coastal A zone, and then much less wave height potential beyond that. And so the key points of this would be that in the VE zone, it does not take that much flood depth over the first floor elevation of the structure just to where it starts incurring this 50% loss threshold. When you move to a slightly lesser wave environment, again, a little deeper depth, and finally a little further deeper depth within this area where we don't have wave action. So this would be a higher frequency flood each time. So our general approach, again, was to just look at the site and understand what the wave potential was and what type of flood event would impact that structure. If it's a very catastrophic event, as it is in the case example we're showing here, we would expect those high wave heights and choose that type of damage function to get towards these trigger mechanisms. And then Basically, we determine the present day probability of 50% damage, and then look at how that changes in time to understand how that probability goes into the other items that define the trigger event. One thing we do want to talk about with sea level rise a lot of times, and this is a figure adapted from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but we have increasing areas exposed to floodplains, so we have more properties that will be incurring loss, but also those properties that are already there or at the edge of the floodplain will incur higher flood depths, and they will incur greater wave action. So we have to consider all these parts and pieces in the puzzle. So in the case at Point, we have a home that has a first floor elevation with about 9.4 feet, which is relatively high for the area of interest, and it takes quite a high flood to impact this property, between 500 and 1,000 year flood. So we know that it's going to be subject to significant wave action given the recurrence interval of that flood, and then we can look at today's annual probability for 50% damage, and we're also showing recurrence intervals here for those that understand that better. And then how that changes in time, and looking towards, you know, at what point does the change in the exposure, the probabilistic exposure of this property trigger that transfer of rights and transfer of ownership to the trust. And just to illustrate the difference between the two types of exposure, we can look at, you know, with wave damage and without wave damage, and we can see that, you know, the recurrence intervals, I think, illustrate it better, but from a 4,000 type year event to an event that would be a 200,000 year event or greater. But we, you know, I think the dramatic thing here to illustrate is how that changes in time with sea level rise and getting towards that trigger event. So the next steps that we're working through in the process is just refining the selection of these depth damage curves to integrate into a tool that can be applied to different properties, and also combined with the other considerations in the effort, and that'll be reviewed by an advisory group, and then I think pilot tested in this effort. If there's any questions, just including some contact information here, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Brian. And, you know, that excited to hit the question of the 50% loss threshold and discuss that further, hopefully in the Q&A. We spent some time today in the conference talking about culture and social infrastructure, but incredibly important to have a kind of an equitable and clear process for damage assessment moving forward. So now I would like to introduce a very familiar figure on the Columbia campus, Dorothy. And her talk is titled Managing Retreat Through Natural Barriers. And Dorothy, we've talked quite a bit about blue carbon in the past, and so very excited to see your presentation. Dorothy, please share your screen.
Well, I'm excited, to be a part of this little group here because I'm learning from all of you, and this whole conference is great, especially case studies. What I'm going to talk about is just how important these marshes are, as particularly in New York City and New York environments, because we have such an urban environment with so many people located here. And just to back up and talk about why we care about wetlands, we knew many, many reasons that we care about them as aquifers, as protection. But one of the things we didn't know about them was just how important the carbon stocks in them are, and I'll come to that. But not only for that, but for something else, which we've discovered as we've taken sediment cores. And generally we look at the organics in the cores, anything that was living, and get a nitrogen history and a carbon history and a pollen history, which tells us what plants were growing there. But we also get an inorganic signal, so the sand, silt, and clay that helps to keep the marsh together. And we also get the heavy metals. And that's one thing that is really scary when you look at the history of heavy metal contamination in the New York area. Just to tell you some of the methods we use, we count 300 grains per sample. We look at macrofossils and foraminifera, which tell us past sea level rise. We can date individual plant remains, and we can get isotopic signals, and I'll show you some, as well as the X-ray fluorescence, which gives us all the heavy metals, and the upland influx of sediment. So this is just one example, I think, that shows how much carbon we're losing when that erodes and goes into the water. But it's interesting that the heavy metals also really adhere to the organics, not to the sand, silt, or clay, but that is why the marshes have such heavy contamination. It's basically tied up in these marshes and doesn't affect fish and wildlife until they erode. So 2 sites, that was Yellow Bar that I just showed you eroding. We've also looked at Joko and a number of these other marshes, but notice how the shoreline is hardened. In other words, there's just, this all used to be marsh, and now it's gone because we built on it, such as JFK. And this is 1888 USGS map. You can see all these marshes surrounding it. And then today, the difference. And these are our core sites. What I really want to show you, we burn the sample and it looks as if it's getting more organic. That's the percent in a 1 meter core. And our cores go down, in this case, about 4 meters. But we're just going to look at the top. But when you separate it out, the green here is the organic, the blue is actually the inorganic. And we see this huge decline in sand, silt, and clay in all the marshes. And that's what has helped them to hold together in the past. So this is a busy slide, but just to show you here, the y-axis is down to 1.2 meters. We get profiles of pollen that tell us about the history of disturbance and the Europeans' arrival. Ragweed is native, but we see it come in when trees are cut and then decline in the late 20th century as the forests have grown back. But we also have these other tie points. This is a lead isotope signal here that we get for 1839. And up here, just as an example too, we get the decline, the ban on leaded gasoline, which helps us to date this core. Here you see, again, this big decline in sand, silt, and clay, along with this titanium, which is also telling us upland erosion into the marsh, which has declined because the streams, basically the streams have stopped bringing in sediment. So we have higher production or less decomposition, which has enabled the marsh to really keep up with sea level rise in one way, but at the same time, you have this huge decline in sediment, which means that it's falling apart. So even though it has grown faster or there's less decomposition, maybe because of pollution, they're fragmenting terribly. And I just wanted to show 2 more marshes we've looked at in Queens, where we basically see the same story. This is Northern Boulevard, I think, going out to Long Island. This is the Alley core site, and Udall's a little further east. And again, we see these big declines in sediment, which hold it together. And we see the lead increase in the industrial age and then the decline. And this is the same sort of signal in Alley Marsh as well. Udalls, we do see an increase in carbon storage, and that's probably due to the pollution as well. But with the future of warmer temperatures, drought, sea level rise, we know that these marshes are at huge risk. We know that it's the loss of the mineral matter that is contributing to the fragmentation. And it's so dangerous because it's an urban area and because it has accumulated for so long, we have this problem that if they continue to erode, not only will they not protect the shoreline, but they will release all these heavy metals, which, you know, go up the food chain, and some people do live off the fish and the crabs in the marshes. So the resilience then is compromised. What can we do about it? One of the things we can do is try to clean up our estuaries from nitrogen, because that has also made them more fragile. Other researchers have showed that the roots are compromised when they have this extra nitrogen in the water, and that makes them more fragile as well. Phragmites in some places it grows because of the high nitrogen and outpaces the native plants. And we've seen in a lot of sites that drought and colder climate of the past diminish the carbon sequestration, which these marshes are really important for throughout not only our coastlines, but in our northern peatlands. So we know that the marshes cannot keep pace, partly because this mineral sediment has not been coming in. We know that in Jamaica Bay, the thin layer sediment has worked. People have worked to replant, and the marshes have been greatly aided that way. Whether there's funding to add more is a large question for New York, but it certainly is another layer of importance when you think about all the heavy metals that would go into the water if we do not. So again, we need to enhance the nitrogen removal, which would be a win-win, lots of ways: water quality, native plants, and keeping local communities safe. And I'll stop right there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dorothy. So many lessons there on the interrelatedness of so many different systems, the nitrogen system, and the multi-purpose benefits of intact marshes, whether it's for carbon storage or protective value, or for maintaining these heavy metals in situ. So now we will transition to another well-known figure in the New York region, Dr. Judith Weis of Rutgers University. And another person that, like many on this call, love marshes. So Judy, please share your screen. Her title is Retreat of Salt Marshes, Natural, Managed, or Blocked.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, we're going to hear some more about marshes. We might ask a little bit at the beginning.
And Judy, if you want to do full screen, you can use that little button on the lower right. There you go. Thanks.
Okay. What are salt marshes? Well, they're wetlands that surround an estuary being where freshwater and saltwater mix. You can see the aerial view on the left. On the right is a view of the marsh. You can see right in the front, right by the water, is what we call the low marsh. It sits in the water. They're covered at high tide. Behind them is the high marsh. So the low marsh is flooded twice daily and dominated by smooth cordgrass or Spartina alterniflora. The high marsh includes a variety of salt-tolerant species. They're not flooded regularly, but the roots are growing in salty mud, so they have to be salt-tolerant. Functions of salt marshes, again, are breeding grounds for all kinds of things: fish, shrimp, crabs, birds, stopping place for migratory birds, habitat for a number of mammals. Marshes are very highly productive, and they do ecosystem services for people. They purify the water, they sequester pollutants such as heavy metals, talked about just before, and carbon dioxide, keeping some of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They also protect coastal communities from storms. They'll diminish the wind penetration and wave strength. And a study after Hurricane Sandy found the damage done to communities was inversely proportional to the amount of wetland area in front of the community. So there was a great savings if a community had a salt marsh in front of them. Some important marsh animals include ribbed mussels here, whose threads, byssus threads right here, attach to sediment grains and help to bind the sediments together, which is useful to reduce erosion. They also, their nitrogenous wastes enable the growth of the Spartina. There's a variety of crabs we find in salt marshes. I just want to mention fiddler crabs up here that dig burrows, and the burrows, if they're not too dense, help the Spartina by helping aerate the sediment down below. This crab, the marsh crab, can be damaging to the marsh. As you see, they will eat the marsh grass, and if there's dense populations, that could be a problem. We have a variety of fishes. The three on the top, the mummy chug, silver sides, and sheep's head minnow, are closely associated with marshes. Others are found in the marshes passing through and regularly found near marshes. And then there's all kinds of birds, not going into any of the details of the birds, but one finds lots of birders around salt marshes. Getting to this issue of sea level rise, it's happening because of expansion of water when it gets warmer. And recently, more of the expansion, more of the rise is due to melting of glaciers that are melting faster and faster. The rate of sea level rise is getting faster and faster. And marsh, being intertidal, has to get enough sediment to keep up with sea level rise, or else it needs to migrate inland. And if it can't do either of those things, it will drown and disappear. The pattern one sees is where the marsh will have some standing water at low tide when the water is supposed to have left. So you see mostly marsh with some water becoming mostly water with some marsh, becoming open water and no marsh left at all. And that's the sad story of marsh loss. In the New York, New Jersey area, particularly New Jersey, which can't be very different from New York, the rate of sea level rise is higher than average, being over 5 millimeters per year. And most of the marshes in New Jersey, from a study we did, is that they don't get enough sediment to keep pace. Most of them are not rising up significantly higher than that 5 to 6 millimeters per year. The Delaware Bay marshes are migrating inland. And this picture is showing that. Here's the marsh with a forest behind. Sea level rises, the marsh moves back and takes over some area from the forest, leaving standing dead tree trunks, what they call a ghost forest. That's fine in Delaware Bay. Much of the rest of the state of New Jersey is more developed, and they don't have empty space behind to move into. A situation that somebody has termed coastal squeeze, which is a term I love. In addition to losing the vertical space, they are losing horizontal area, losing acreage through erosion at the edge, shown on the pictures on the right. They get undercut by the water, and the chunks of marsh fall in. This can be seen from historical photographs. Here is a beach in Delaware Bay, 1930 and 2015. Those red dots are at the same location. They were on the marsh here, but the marsh has receded back in those years. Even shorter and more dramatic loss is here in Great Bay, where starting in 85 and going to about 2015, you see these losses. And this shoreline here, this edge of the marsh has certainly continued to recede since 2015. So the idea of the marsh being able to move inland when there is some development behind, such as places like this. Here's a marsh that's in trouble, but there's all this development right behind it. Here's a marsh and there's a bulkhead right behind it. So it can't go anywhere. This is situations of coastal squeeze. Where are you going to go? And that gets into some theme that has been the major theme of this conference of managed retreat, protecting the land, talking about retreat of the marshes in this case, protecting land upland by transfer of property to the public, things that Brian was talking about, buying up the private property, conservation easements, and so forth. And where possible, remove paved surfaces like roads to allow for marsh migration. This is the purview of local towns and municipalities. And this is not easy. This is main themes of this conference about environmental justice, political and sociological issues of the loss of community, and particularly marginalized communities that are not treated fairly. So we're having issues in urban estuaries where there's little space to move inland, and enabling marsh migration by land protection will be extremely expensive because property values are high. In rural areas, I read recently this paper by Vandola et al. About low-lying communities in Chesapeake Bay and the challenges of equity and fairness and environmental justice regarding marsh migration. And there's potential conflicts between the human values and the ecological values. Here on the left is a house all alone, and it's an abandoned house. People living here on Deal Island tend to be retirees, some of the watermen, people that are not rich, and their major wealth they have is their house. And if they can't sell their house, they have no money to buy another house inland. So migrating inland is a very difficult thing unless they can get the financial resources to do so. The picture on the right is a Black church. And this church and graveyard had been around for centuries and are a cultural heritage for these people. So, we ecologists can blithely talk about just, get the properties out of the way so the marsh can move inland. We have potential conflicts here with the marsh migration that we ecologists are pushing versus the effects on people, which is, of course, the major theme of this conference. And this is a diagram from the Vandola paper. And you see on the left side, all the good things that are happening to the ecosystem when you allow the marsh to move in. And at the same time, in red, all the bad things that are happening to the people living in those houses. So we've got this conflict. I must say, though, that the negative effects on the people are not due to the marsh migration. They're due to sea level rise and will happen whether there's a marsh there or not. So the bad effects on people and all the stuff we're talking about in this conference is inevitable sooner or later. And I don't think we should blame these things on marsh migration, but on sea level rise. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so many things to think about relative to the time and the coastal squeeze, the rising seas and the need to act now. And of course, highlighting the sort of interconnectedness of human and natural systems here. So now we will, I'd invite Marit Larson, a figure very well known and beloved in the New York context, to present her presentation, Salt Marsh Migration as Conservation Strategy. Marit. And you might be on mute.
Yeah, thank you, sorry. Getting started. So I want to thank those who thank Judith and Dorothy. That I'm going to go right back up to the start. They basically set a fantastic stage for me. My name again is Marit Larson, and I'm the chief of the Natural Resources Group at New York City Parks. We manage all of the natural areas in the park system, about 12,000 acres. And today, just gonna focus, like several of the previous speakers, on salt marshes in particular. And a lot of what I'm talking about is work is based on work that you've heard about, that Dorothy and Judith have done. And I'm gonna be trying to then lean on their work and explanations and focus kind of on our perspective as land managers and stewards of this natural area. So in New York City, we've got 520 miles of shoreline, as you've heard about, and most of that shoreline had tidal marsh historically prior to colonization, and we've lost most of that marsh, of course, largely been filled, but we still have a significant amount of important marsh left. As we've heard in New York City, in the park system alone, we have over 2,000 acres of salt marsh, and that's about half of what's in the marsh area, largely across New York, outside of the Jamaica Bay area that you heard talked about. So we've heard about the essential elements of salt marshes, and in New York City, I'll just underscore that even here we have hundreds of species that rely on their life cycle on marshes still. And as the landowners, and speaking from the Parks Department, these are also really resilient areas that people access and enjoy, and they are, just by virtue of being there, sort of have a value that's really sustainable, except for the threats that we've also heard talk about. So while in New York in particular has benefited hugely from the Clean Water Act and no longer direct filling, we've got an incredible amount of ongoing loss. The vulnerability of our systems is what we're causing us to really look at marsh migration in particular as a conservation strategy. So we've estimated around the city in our largest marshes that we're losing about 6 or more acres a year just in the marshes that we've actually kind of measured, and that conversion to open water and mudflat that Judith talked about are real problems. And we're of course contending with the barriers around these marshes that limit migration. We've looked over the last decade in particular really closely at the conditions of our largest salt marshes in partnership with the Natural Areas Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy. And in addition to better understanding their ecological condition, we've looked at how models of inundation and habitat change could perhaps help us steer us in a way of where we could better manage. And so to that end, we worked with partners to develop a sea level affecting marshes model for parks in particular. And this work over the last decade really culminated this year in the production of a wetlands management framework for New York City that we put together with the Natural Areas Conservancy. It's a way of, for us, it's important to highlight the work that we've done over the last 10 years across all wetland types, and really emphasize this importance, especially in with a new focus on climate change, of the importance of no net loss and what we can try to do about it, both retaining our wetlands and improving their health, and what kind of funding, restoration tactics stewardship and policies we need. And this slide kind of summarizes some of the recommendations specifically in our salt marsh areas. So we need to keep doing the kind of restoration and management we're doing where we can, excavating historic fill, for example, removing debris, and importantly, engaging with communities. But we also have to pilot more of the type of work you heard mentioned that we haven't done as much of, which is to address our eroding shorelines, building out living shorelines. This is a little picture here of work we're just piloting this year in the Alley Creek and Little Neck Bay, applying sediment, the mineral soil to these starved systems, as Dorothy mentioned. These are expensive and costly and difficult to permit and often execute projects. And so we also are looking specifically where we can facilitate marsh migration, even given all of our constraints. So where we have infrastructure right up to and in our roads, are there modifications we can do as infrastructure gets upgraded to facilitate eco passages, facilitate hydrologic connections? Are there, where are there barriers that we can remove? All critical because most of our marshes don't have significant room to migrate. So in addition to work on the ground, we have to consider what policy actions we can take, and our framework really lays out in the future what we need to do with respect to trying to consider acquisition and transfer. We've done that in our work over the last years, is identify where we could prioritize opportunities for acquisition or propose acquisition and seek funding for acquisition. These maps show a couple of areas in marshes in Northwest Staten Island where we have the largest potential to have marshes migrate, and they often migrate into private property. So we are looking at, are there ways that we can acquire particularly land that it will be flooded and vulnerable and can't be developed. So we've worked with other agencies also for years in transferring properties to parks, especially those that have the highest conservation values, but we also need to look at other mechanisms. We can't maybe buy a 50-acre property to protect 1 acre marsh, but maybe easements and land conservation organizations can help us work on this. In particular, we want to focus on how that the migration to ensure that migration can happen where it can around our biggest parks. So our modeling work and on the ground analysis has shown that there are hundreds of acres just in our parkland that we could ideally preserve. Some of the additional acreage we could get is on private land and public lands. So we, every bit counts. So we're working on that. But there also is, it's much more difficult to look at the little splinters of potential future wetland across the city divided into hundreds of parcels that get us a little bit closer to helping offset the loss that we know we're going to see with erosion and conversion to open water. Because understanding how this is happening on our parkland is so important, we're lucky enough to get a grant from EPA to look at these processes. We're looking both at how well we're going to be doing at applying sediment onto our marshes and building them out in living shorelines. But this, what I'm highlighting here, is a goal that we have to look specifically at future marsh where we anticipate it to come, and also what has recently become marsh, and better understand and how that migration can happen. Are there factors that facilitate, that we could do to facilitate salt marsh establishment in particular? And so our objectives are to study both where we've modeled that future marsh could occur and where it's been newly established, and to develop metrics that consider both the landscape condition, sediment, physical hydrologic conditions, chemical conditions, and try to then be able to focus and prioritize better across our many miles of shoreline. The other area in which we're looking is in neighborhoods where there is inadvertent marsh migration, not next to parkland. Ramblersville is kind of a famous example you may have heard of, certainly if you're from the New York area, a residential area in Jamaica Bay that had a heavy impact from Hurricane Sandy. The Build It Back program was very active in this area. In particular, there were some buyouts that happened in one little neighborhood where now 16 lots are being transferred over to Parks Department, where there's not been previous parks before. So what's unique and perhaps promising about this neighborhood is that the community, lots of people stayed, but in the community in general, there's a preference to return these lots or restore them to salt marsh, to open space. We're fortunate there are relatively few restoration challenges compared to the many challenges we have in other places that Parks is willing to take them on without funding, and that there's additional open space to acquire. So it's a perhaps new vision of how a community might change over time. And so it was really interesting to hear the talk from Brian Batten about mechanisms perhaps for homes changing over in the future, because this is such a low-lying area. So with that, I'd just say there's obviously lots of work that we need to do as landowners in conjunction with community and other agencies, and outreach, engagement, and funding for restoration, and policy tools and regulatory support are all key elements of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Marit, and congratulations to you and the entire team on the Wetlands Management Framework. It's a huge accomplishment, and this final case study on migration pathways in developed communities is certainly a lesson for the future. Very, very useful as a case study. So now I would like, if you would stop sharing your screen, Marit, I will turn it over to Alison Branco, another very familiar face in the New York City landscape, and Director of Coastal Programs for the Nature Conservancy. Alison.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of these salt marsh lovers and long-term thinkers. I'm really excited about this session. So as Kate said, I'm Alison Branco. My title is the Director of Coastal Programs for the Nature Conservancy in New York. And what that means is that I'm part of a statewide team working on climate adaptation. And we are really focused on flooding, because that is the biggest impact from climate change that we're seeing across New York. And I just want to acknowledge that long list of colleagues that you see at the bottom there. What I'm going to talk to you about today is really a team effort among all of us. So I will just start by saying something that everyone has said, so I won't belabor it, but floodplains are really important. And you've heard a lot of the benefits that they provide, both to the environment and to the critters, but also to human society. And I will just add that it's not only salt marshes that have all these important benefits. Our floodplains all along our rivers and even around the Great Lakes are also just as important, just as productive, and need all that flooding to happen to be healthy into the future. And, as we know, especially in New York, but certainly everywhere, we have loved our water so much that we have built right up to the edge of it. And when we do that, we create flooding, and we sort of create this conflict between all the water and the people. And so now, thanks to climate change and other things we're doing in our watersheds, that water is rising and we're increasing that conflict. So this natural process of flooding that is supposed to be beneficial is now creating problems for people. And the ways that we as people are handling those problems are then in turn creating problems for the floodplain and preventing them from functioning the way that they're supposed to. And I'll just point out, as others have, that these problems created by flooding, the problems for people, are not experienced the same way by everyone. And so folks who have hardship or vulnerabilities in other aspects of life are far more vulnerable to these impacts of flooding. So the Nature Conservancy And really probably most of us early on in our careers and in our thinking about these issues, it was really all about protecting nature from people. And we really have changed to sort of focus on a different mission, which is looking toward a vision of a future where people and nature are thriving together. And I think, you know, many of us in the natural science community have come around to this viewpoint, and I think we need the whole world to sort of come around to this viewpoint. This diagram is sort of meant to show the paradigm that we're currently living in and the one that we need to switch to. So the bottom half here is kind of where we are now. We're not trying to coexist with our floodplains, and certainly not with all of this water. We are trying to protect ourselves. We are holding our property rights very tightly and building things around us to keep the water out so that we don't have to change the way we live at all. And so we have lots and lots of hardened solutions, a few hardened solutions with some nice little bits of natural benefits as well, and very few places where we're protecting and restoring those natural floodplains and the floodplain function, or even moving out of them and getting out of the way of all that water. And what we really need to do is flip that around and sort of redistribute all those different solutions to this people-water conflict and have a lot more natural functioning floodplains and save those hardened solutions that are preventing all those great benefits of floodplains only for the places where they're the very most needed. And so what I would argue is that sort of the old paradigm where we defend first, and then if we can't do that anymore, we accommodate all the water. And then only when everything else fails do we retreat and get out of the way of the water. That's sort of our old paradigm. And we need to flip this around and switch it completely upside down. So first we need to protect. So, you know, like they say in the medical profession, first do no harm. First and foremost, let's not make this problem worse. Let's not add to the conflict between people and water. Let's not put more people in the floodplain. And then whenever we can, let's back up and make way for all that water, because we all know it's coming whether we want it to or not. So let's make room for it and allow the floodplain to function. When that's not possible, then maybe we can adjust the way we live in the floodplain to accommodate the water. And then only where it's absolutely necessary should we defend ourselves from that water by building hard structures, for example. So to accomplish this sort of flip of the paradigm, what we would propose is what we call a flood adaptation hierarchy. Essentially kind of a stepwise decision-making process where you start at the top of this list and you go down one at a time. Can we do this? Then yes, then we should do that. And if we can't, then we go to the next, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that we're trying to base it on really honestly weighing all of the trade-offs of the various different flood management options we have, and trying to really optimize for not just protection of people, but also protection of nature. We're prioritizing long-term benefits, as others have talked about, because that's really important. And really trying to preserve the dynamic processes that are so essential to healthy floodplains whenever we can. And the goal here is not to say that any one land management or flood management option is always good or always bad, because that's just silly. The idea is to acknowledge that all the situations are different, the context is different. And so this is meant to be a flexible framework that helps you to make that optimal decision, but take into account all that context and what's really doable and feasible where you are. And the idea is that when we zoom out and look across the landscape, not just at a single site, then we have a different distribution of these solutions, so that we have lots of floodplains that are protected and functioning and that we've made way for water in, and just a few places where it was really the most necessary, where we've hardened and protected infrastructure there. For example, like a wastewater treatment plant, they often have to be in the floodplain. They work by gravity. They have to be at the low point. They have to discharge into the water. So maybe it's okay to harden and protect those. You know, the last 10 feet of your lawn and your bocce ball court, maybe you could let those go and allow the floodplain to function there. So we start at the top, protect. Next step is undeveloped. That's what most of us have been talking about, and obviously the theme of the whole conference. Lots of different mechanisms to undevelop the floodplain, which makes people safer. And then we can't forget, we can't just leave the floodplain a mess. We have to restore the function of the floodplain when we leave. When we can't do that, we should think about passive risk reduction options like raising houses, for example. Then when that's not doable, maybe we think of more active options like some deployable flood walls, which you see sometimes in riverine floodplains, or Mobile buildings, which you see sometimes at the beach, you know, the bathroom and concession buildings are actually mobile, and they wheel them out of there when a hurricane is coming or in the wintertime. And then those living shoreline, hybrid shoreline kind of options where you're definitely preventing some of those natural floodplain functions, but trying to preserve some as well. And then last, only if you really need to, should you harden, where you have really very few co-benefits to nature, and you're just protecting a building. And long-term, if everyone does that, nobody's gonna wanna live on the coast anymore. And it's important to note that implementation of a hierarchy like this, it all sounds well and good, but as we all know, if every property owner is thinking individually on their own property about what they want, we'll have the situation we have now, which is sort of the race to the bottom here. Well, I can do it, whatever about everybody else, but I need to harden because I don't want to have to change the way I live at all. So in order to implement something like this, we really need some things like incentives or regulations or planning to sort of prevent that race to the bottom, and put some sort of gates in there to prevent that. And again, we wouldn't prescribe one particular appropriate way to implement that, because depending on the context, the size of the area you're looking at, those kind of things, different things will be relevant in different places. But incentives like the community rating system or grant funding, for example, regulations like building codes or wetland permits, planning like coastal zone management plans or comprehensive plans, which we've heard a little bit about today, all ways to kind of help redistribute the way we use these different options in our landscape. And I'll just point out lastly, this kind of hierarchical decision-making framework, it's very, very similar to the compensatory mitigation framework, which I think everybody's pretty familiar with. That's an environmental regulation that is put into place when someone wants to build something and do damage to the environment. And the idea is basically first you avoid, and then you minimize, and then you mitigate. In other words, make up for whatever damage you do. And it's sort of the same kind of an idea. And a stepwise framework like this, you know, we're talking about it in terms of flooding, but it could be very useful for other climate impacts as well, like fire, for example, or drought. And I will just say, lastly, that we have tried to articulate this concept in a paper that we've just recently submitted for publication. So given that likely will be under review and revised, I'm very interested in everyone's feedback. So please do get in touch with me. My email address is there, or you can use the Cool Conference platform to contact me. I would love to hear anyone's feedback on this. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Alison, and so appreciate the emphasis on the paradigm change and also this kind of structured approach to decision making, so many decisions that we will face in the future. So now for a different geography, a different geographical context, I'd like to invite Scott Warner to share screen. Scott, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Hopefully this all shows up right now. Well, I very much appreciate being here. I'm Scott Warner, a principal hydrogeologist with the BBJ Group in Northern California, also a doctoral researcher with the University of Newcastle in Australia, working with my, my colleague, Dr. Ravi Naidu. I am sitting here in Northern California. I'm not an Australian. This is the Newcastle area where it would be about 9:30 in the morning tomorrow. I work professionally here in the Bay Area. I haven't been able to go to Newcastle for the last year and a half due to COVID, but nonetheless, still working with them quite closely. Newcastle has had a year of too much rain. Here in California, we've had a year of not enough rain. This is the way it kind of goes. And what I want to do is also tag on to the earlier presenters, Dorothy and Judy and Alison, Marit. You know, we've been talking about coastal processes on marshes, the effectiveness of marshes for essentially sequestering heavy metals and other elements like that, which are important. One of the things I want to actually do here is go to another area, and that is the developed risk management of our contaminated lands already, and what it means when we're talking about retreat. Can there be a retreat? So this is my focus here, and we'll talk a little bit about that over these next few minutes. First, I like to always acknowledge the traditional coastline.
Your screen? I just wanted to make sure that we don't see your screen if you're sharing the screen. I wasn't sure if you were sharing it, but just letting you know.
Oh, you don't. Let's try this again. I am sorry.
One more time. Yeah, no problem. You have a beautiful landscape behind you. So, oh, there we go. So if you just hit that lower right hand.
You see it now?
Yes.
How is that? Is that better? Hooray. Yes? All good, I hope.
Yes, we see actually the presenter view, but
you know, I thought I was doing this correctly, and okay, here we go. We're going to do this better. You know, there's always somebody that's the problem here. Okay, we're going to try it there, and we're going to go here. And what are you seeing now?
I think that looks good. It's not full screen, but we see one slide, so that looks
okay. Good. Well, let's do this then. Okay, so the background being the city of San Francisco, over from Emeryville, and let's go to my second slide. And I'd like to honor here the caretakers of the land, the traditional custodians of the land in which I reside, the Coast Miwok here in Northern California, and the Aba Bakal at Newcastle. Newcastle is about 100 miles north of Sydney. The background is of Newcastle, the Merriweather Bath, so another coastal area. The New York Times and other media have pointed to the issue of toxic landscape, contaminated lands that are in the area of floods. A number of studies have demonstrated this. Along the coastline of the United Kingdom, there are some 1,700 landfills that are in a coastal area where erosion and other impacts from sea level rise and incursion are occurring. The question becomes, what do we do about these particular areas when we're also talking about the social and community aspects of potential retreat or protection? And I'm coming at this as a way because we have such an intense built environment, as the speakers before me have indicated. You know, living next to the coastline is easy, right? From a transportation, a economic and environmental perspective, but we've also unfortunately used the coastline as part of our problem areas. So there has to be this question about how we deal with our legacy. We've seen these types of pictures and these types of models, the sea level rise issues, for example, here in San Francisco Bay, and on this slide, the areas of potential inundation with under several different models, 0.5 meter to 3 meters or more of rise in the coming decades. We also can start tracking where those contaminated lands are along the coastline. And so the question becomes, how do we deal with that? And should we deal with that? Can we actually retreat from these areas and still have no problem? You know, I would argue that the answer is no, but one of the first things that we can do and start doing now, thanks to many of the excellent tools that are out there, is start to map using our GIS system, using our, in some jurisdictions, it's not ubiquitous everywhere, but the information stream by which to identify not only where flood incursion, including groundwater rise, may occur. I'm glad Alison brought up the aspect in one of her slides of groundwater rise, because that may be as important from a chronic perspective as the acute perspective of, say, king tide incursions and sea level rise. But groundwater rise, inundation in areas where in fact we have affected areas, contaminated lands that are going to continue to weather and age. And I think one of the things that we can't see right now, I'm a hydrogeologist, so I kind of look at the ground down, although I like volcanoes and all those kinds of things as a geologist. But we have this ongoing issue of groundwater incursion underneath these hazardous waste facilities, ones that we know about, ones that we don't know about. We can build walls around a landfill, but we can't necessarily protect what's underneath in certain areas. But we have new tools now, such as the Shoreline Flood Explorer, which I encourage you, if we had time, I would go through some of it, where we can start looking at different scenarios of sea level rise, on top of storm surges, on top of king tides, for example, and start making some plans. The same thing in the Sydney area. In the lower right-hand corner here is a map of the Sydney catchment area with land use, including industrial and commercial use. And so mapping, again, the rise of sea, rise of groundwater, we can start prioritizing. One of the areas that I think we don't do quite as well, we do a good job, but I'd like to encourage us to do even better. And that is further developing the conceptual model of what's happening in this multi-dimensional space. So it's not just the sea, it's also the groundwater. It's also from above the climate. Think of intense or exceptional events on top of it. Where our current contaminant areas are, those that are both legacy, those are active, those are that in soil, those are in groundwater. And putting that together to help us identify where we have to prioritize. As the speaker said earlier, it's darn expensive to do everything, and trying to get the funding and having the jurisdictions develop plans amongst themselves is often difficult. But we can start prioritizing, and that's one of the areas I'm interested in doing and have been doing, and looking at where are those areas where land use says sea level rise is primary, where groundwater level is primary, where erosion of protected barriers, both subsurface and above surface, are important, and start to identify these areas that are important. And, you know, case example in my little schematic, which is related to active projects, we have contaminated land for whatever reason it is, whatever kind of legacy from 100 years ago or from 10 years ago. Ocean water's coming up. We're getting more of that saline mixing zone. We have several things that are coming up. Groundwater levels are coming up. We have a change in chemistry and a change in biology, which quite frankly can be in effect and maybe lessen a remedy that has already been put in place. Whether that's a phytoremediation using trees that are more used to fresh water versus maybe a mixed saline water like a mangrove would, or maybe one of the things I work on quite a bit are these, you know, geochemical or biochemical barriers to help prevent, sequester, if you will, contaminants from moving outwards. Changes because of the additional saline and sea level quality water can affect that. And of course, you know, this picture here of these closed landfills that align everywhere from the San Francisco Bay to Baltimore to New York City, et cetera. We can look at them on top, but we don't see what's going on below. That's kind of the iceberg effect. And I think that's where, in this slide, I've just tried to put in together some of those parameters that we want to look at, and an article from a few years ago that I've written. We can predict what's happening tomorrow better than we can 10 years from now. But starting to look at these water quality parameters that are important for biology and geochemistry, I think that's kind of where I'm wanting to go, and then connect those and integrate those with the vulnerability mapping tools that we have. And in the Bay Area, we have some very good ones. In Australia, there's others that are being developed, and I know other jurisdictions are doing this as well. And so we can start developing our plan ahead of time. One thing, and I know we're finishing up here, that we haven't really talked about, and with my colleagues in Australia is really a focus, is what do we do about those low-lying South Pacific islands, like Tuvalu. The New York Times wrote an article 8-9 years ago about trash on this small atoll. So this picture on the right is not a full island. The only island are these essentially sand and coral reefs that ring it. And this dot on the right is the one waste facility. What do we do about those types of islands and communities and nations that don't have the resources that we might have here in the United States? We can still get to those ideas and how to do some sort of prevention without a drastic retreat. But again, this is going to be one of our areas of focus. So with that, I'll thank you with the view of the South San Francisco Bay Area, the salt ponds. You can see the developed land. This is probably some of the more, next to Manhattan, perhaps some of the more expensive land on the planet, figuring the gig economy is all located right down in this area. And this is also an area where some of the earliest Superfund sites were located. So this becomes part of our context moving forward in the discussion. All right, thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you so much, Scott. So important to think about these compounding challenges relative to health. And great, so thank you again. Now I would like to quickly turn it over to Malio Kodis of the Nature Conservancy for our final presentation. Malio.
Thank you. Here we are. Are you seeing the proper screen?
Yes.
Fabulous. All right, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here presenting among so many colleagues. My presentation is really the perfect, I think, bookend to everything that we've talked about. I'm sort of gonna touch on many of the things that everyone discussed and bring it home that if it's not clear to you by now, conservation organizations and those that we work in close partnership with are really critical in thinking about how strategic retreat can be a truly resilient form of climate adaptation. I did this work with the Nature Conservancy while I was getting my Master's of Science in Coastal Science and Policy at UC Santa Cruz. So the thesis is moving out of nature's way strategically can have many benefits for nature and for people. When we see a landscape like this, we think that it is so resilient and beautiful and really the future of what we're all working towards for resilient landscapes. Unfortunately, climate change all too often is represented by pictures like this and this and this. One of the things that I'm going to emphasize now and later in my presentation is that when we're thinking about retreat, it's not just from water, but also from fires. And so we have to adapt to climate change, of course, and we are. But often, and all too often, as we all know, it looks like this. Here we have the Mauna Loa Observatory laid over Sisyphus rolling a ball uphill because we all know we can't rely on walls to keep water out. And it's only getting worse as time goes on and as our emissions don't stop. And so enter the scene retreat. I don't need to explain to anyone here what managed retreat or strategic retreat, as I prefer to call it, is, but all too often it's not strategic or managed. We see retreat is happening, it's rarely strategic. Often it looks like this. I think that we're quite familiar with these scenes of an empty lot, probably nestled in the middle of a neighborhood. Post-disaster buyouts typically have been designed to meet one main objective, and that is individual scale vulnerability reduction. So hopefully the family that perhaps used to live in the house that was bought out here has gotten to higher ground, is living a more safe life free from flooding, but this buyout didn't help that neighborhood or that region really get that much more resilient to climate change. And so the question that I asked during my master's research in partnership with the Nature Conservancy was, how can conservation organizations help put the strategic in strategic retreat? As we know, conservation organizations are experts at many of the really critical elements of this work. So land acquisition and restoration, policy advocacy, and community engagement. But most are focused on preserving already pristine places and not buying out flood damaged properties. As you can imagine, for an organization like the Nature Conservancy, which has built its whole sort of reputation on preserving the most pristine areas, then sort of switching missions to purchase derelict properties is logistically complicated, to say the least. And so I did a number of case studies and a lot of other work around figuring out exactly what the role might be for conservation organizations. And I'm just going to touch on one case study really briefly, just because I think it's not a super mainstream one. So this is Cascades Park. It's in Tallahassee, and it previously was a brown field. So it touches on my colleague's previous presentation on contamination, where now it is an amphitheater concert venue. And when I interviewed someone about this, they were very excited to tell me that the Beach Boys played at this amphitheater. As you can imagine, when it storms, the amphitheater fills up with water. And a number of partners were really creatively engaged to ensure that this is a landscape that's benefiting the whole community, both ecologically and socially. And so again, making way for nature doesn't just mean water. The Nature Conservancy, along with Paradise Recreation and Parks Department, and a number of other partners are exploring how science, acquisition strategy, and funding opportunities can help to create wildfire risk reduction boundaries in Paradise. And this is a pretty unique case study that I want to call out. This park on the right is called Billy Park, and 120 people went to this park during the campfire to seek refuge. They had nowhere to go. All of their exits were literally burning. And they came here, and this park didn't catch fire because it had been constructed under a method used by the police department to make safer and more safe feeling public landscapes. So as a result, there's not a lot of understory. They've cleared a lot of the brush away. And as it turns out, wildfire doesn't spread as quickly. So I'm just inviting us all to think really creatively about how we can partner and think through creative approaches to this work. So these here are some of the 5 ways that I think that conservation organizations across the US can play a really critical role in this work. Again, this is summarizing so much of what my colleagues have so eloquently presented. And so again, moving out of nature's way strategically can absolutely have many benefits for nature and people. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. And I agree, that was a great sort of summary of many of the points and high-level summary of many of the points that we've heard today. So I would like to go directly to some audience questions. We have about 5 minutes and we've heard many themes throughout all of the presentations. So let's get started with some audience questions and maybe try to keep your answers tight. So the question here is for Sara and Juliana. Could you share a bit more about the community engagement process for the Apartadó River Plan? Is there an example of an outreach event?
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we've been basically prioritizing events with communities based on different stakeholders, and we're being very careful to give spaces to ancestral communities. So meeting with indigenous communities and Afro communities separately to not only understand the strategies they have in ecological restoration so far, but also the cosmogony they have around the river, understanding the names they use and the plants they find sacred to use in the restoration process. And I see in the chat they're also asking if we're using this model in other places in Colombia. So right now, the Antioquia state government with the strategy of parks of the river is looking into the Apartadó strategy, so such as like an example to start applying all of these techniques in their other parks. And we've been meeting with them recently, so to understand in which ways they could sort of integrate this vision of this equity and like climate justice into the planning of different parks.
And was it on a volunteer basis or was there a program associated with that? Just as a quick follow-up.
So essentially, the Agriculture and Environmental Planning Department of Apartadó has a great like grassroots connection with different organizations and leaders in territory. So they have a great relationship with indigenous communities and Afro communities, and they've helped us sort of find the people that want to go to the workshops and just like calling them to come to join us. And we've got like a great turnout, so that's been great.
Thank you. Now a question for, I think maybe I'll direct this to Marit. Almost all projects in New York have some form of opposition, right? There's a, and so can you talk about, there's a question that says, we would love to hear about opposition to marsh development or migration support or anything that you've experienced.
Well, I'm not sure if I'll answer the question as it was intended, but in general, there's lots of competing pressures, obviously. Well, I'll give one simple example within the Parks Department. We have the largest, parking lot in the city is in the Parks Department, and it serves the park goers to Orchard Beach. Yet it's in the floodplain, and you look at our models, and it could be future marsh quite wonderfully, but that's there's opposition to that. So that's maybe the simplest one. And then it gets a lot more complex in tighter neighborhoods, and there's different recreational needs and demands. And then there's also the placement of berms for flood protection, and those can go through marsh areas too. So those are some examples.
Any competing priorities in the urban landscape? Yes, experience that. Let's see, I have a question maybe for Alison. congratulations on the paper being submitted. And where are areas that, what are areas or geographies that you're excited about testing this framework in? I know TNC is involved in the Mississippi River. My urban design studio studying the Mississippi River right now as a living river concept with some managed retreat embedded, and TNC is involved in many sites around the world. Is there anything that you're particularly excited about in terms of testing the framework, or any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I would love to be able to test it in a variety of places, because I think the application will be super different. For example, in a more rural place versus a more urban place. In talking with folks in New York City, we all know that probably those places will wind up lower on that hierarchy more often, because there's less choice when you have a super highly developed watershed and a lot more competing priorities, like Marit was talking about. So ideally, we'd really like to get a lot of different places. And what we're working on in New York right now is trying to work with a variety of local governments who are sort of early adopters in the retreat space, kind of ready to at least talk about it and think about it and maybe do it, and see if they can incorporate this kind of thing. But I think those folks that are ready to talk about retreat now are going to be the best early adopters of this kind of hierarchy, because they will at least have kind of accepted all of the options as on the table, and then we can try to apply it better.
Great, thank you. So I'm sad to report that we've hit the 8 o'clock top of the hour. I feel like hopefully this conversation can carry on in a future managed retreat conference. I wish that I was able to physically say hello and thank you to all of our presenters. But I will close the session here and just say, in these 8 presentations, we've seen so much overlap, and that kind of final point, Alison, on the need for pilots seems totally clear. That the time to start is now, and to apply this great research, whether it's through and we've really seen tonight the overlapping issues of nitrogen contamination, the urban edge, the coastal squeeze, local stewardship, and so many other factors that are so critical in ecosystem conservation. Thank you all for participating in the conference, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.